From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. This audio poem is a Switchyard exclusive. In November 2022, Natasha Trethewey came to Tulsa to visit the Greenwood District, the site of the 1921 race massacre. She also witnessed the last days of the excavation of Oak Lawn Cemetery, where some victims are buried. She wrote this poem sequence about that experience.
This is a poem called Ground Truth, in two parts. The epigraph from the first part, from Muriel Rukeyser, reads, "Here is your road, tying you to its meanings." 1. Inner Dispersal Loop, I-244, Greenwood. Not just through, but over, above, as if to show there is something that matters more. Inscribe it on the landscape, a message in concrete and rebar, monument to the nation's ideals. Which is why these roads always cut through the heart of. Why officials will say blight, urban renewal, eminent domain, name them MLK Jr. when they mean demolish, isolate, divide. Here you can stand beneath it, look up, hear the rumbling roar of engines, as during the invasion, how survivors recalled planes flying low, surveying the burning, the citizens of Greenwood as they fled, and the National Guard overseeing that first dispersal, that first destruction. The second poem in the sequence has an epigraph from W.E.B. Du Bois, 1919. We return fighting. 2. Notes for a poem on the Tulsa Race Massacre, Veterans Day, November 11th, 2022. The first day I spent in Tulsa, I woke that morning to a parade gathering outside my window, a commemoration begun in 1918 as Armistice Day, marking the end of the Great War. At Elgin and Archer, I was just blocks from the place I'd come to see, the heart of it, Black Wall Street, yet another site steeped in the residue of history, of white mob violence settled down in the soil. Watching the staging area, the flatbed trucks lining the route, I couldn't stop seeing scenes of the invasion. Massacre in Greenwood, the dead hauled away, black men paraded through the streets, women and children rounded up for internment, carted through town, through the jeering cheers of whites, some of them, survivors recalled, boys, young as 10 years old. Call it coincidence or synchronicity, the term Carl Jung gave to the phenomenon of events coinciding as if related, but with no causal connection. The morning of the parade, I wasn't thinking of armistice, that you could trace the events of 1921 back to the war, to black soldiers returning determined to end Jim Crow, to fight for democracy at home. I was thinking only of how many times I'd heard a similar story, the same equation, whites incited to violence by an accusation, false or not, a through line across time and space, as far north as Duluth, Minnesota, 1920, where a white mob abducted 3 black men from jail and hanged them from a lamppost, all the way south to my home state Mississippi, 1955, the seed barn where two white men tortured Emmett Till, a black child, for whistling at a white woman. The bridge over the Tallahatchie where they put a bullet in his head, tied him with barbed wire to a fan, and dumped his body in the river. Days later, a ripple, a snag in the water where he would not be held down, his body come back, a single toe rising above the surface as if to signal, I am here, you will not erase me, my body of evidence. Some say coincidence is pattern revealed. Decades before Till would become another item in our national ledger, the citizens of Greenwood were reading the papers, watching the patterns emerge: white mob violence, lynching and Negro drives, blacks run out of town, their homes looted and burned in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, Springfield, Illinois, 1908, Forsyth County, Georgia, 1912, East St. Louis, 1917, Chicago, 1919. They were watching patterns of rhetoric, language, evidence of thought, as in Nab Negro, the headline in the Tulsa Tribune that day in May. How not to read in it the syntax of the imperative, as in a thing still to be done, a call to action. One witness swore he saw the words lynch Negro that day in the paper, where there was only Nab Negro and a poem, Do It Now, about swatting flies. We must show no ruth or pity to the fly. In the country or the city, he must die. From this distance, I can still see the connections, the inference, like the rhyme I heard a white boy chant when we were children in school. Niggers and flies I do despise. Nab Negro, do it now. In Tulsa, on the TV news, a retired Army officer was talking about unity, saying brothers and sisters, saying those who served can come together, show support, share commonalities, love each other. But I don't know. After January 6th, it's hard to believe those words. It took 120 years for Congress to pass an anti-lynching law named for Emmett Till. The year before he was murdered, Eisenhower changed the name Armistice Day to Veterans Day, a way to include more veterans, more wars. But I can't help thinking in metaphor, how it replaced a word that meant suspension of fighting, hostile behavior. That was 1954, the same year as Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision ending segregation, advancing civil rights, the kind of change in America that has always led to rage, recalcitrance. To send a message, new monuments to white supremacy went up around the country. A bronze Robert E. Lee in Montgomery, Alabama, a Robert E. Lee Elementary in Washington State, the Confederate battle flag raised again on the flagpole in Georgia, statues mustered as far north as Maine, as far west as Oregon. Continuity, too, is pattern. In Tulsa, on Veterans Day, nearly as many people participated in the parade as descended on Greenwood. Imagine the possibility of that much remembering, reckoning, armistice. Watching the news, I wondered how many of them, so close to the massacre, the ground on which they paraded, remembered it, or recalled the service of black soldiers in World War I, how one black unit, the 369th, spent more time at the front, suffered more casualties than any other American troops, how some black soldiers returned and were lynched in uniform, sometimes by white brothers because they were in uniform. Even now, they get lost in our national memory, gaps and erasures, a whites-only version of a segregated war. Think of it. 1921, those black veterans in uniform marching to the courthouse to prevent a lynching, uphold the rule of law, and the white mob they faced. I keep thinking how much it would matter if this history were part of our American curriculum, if every child learned it in school, all of it, even if it made them feel bad for the actions of people in the past, a feeling akin to empathy. A generous thought, my father always said, is the idea of justice taking root, a kind of redress, which is why I go back to one postcard of the burning, how the photographer must have shot from high above, a God's eye view, words forming in his mind as if he'd been deputized to write the scripture of this scene, a long road upon which a few people have gathered, perhaps to take a last look, smoke darkening the distant sky, and above them, in white, the words, ruining the Negro out of Tulsa. Coincidence, his misspelling, heavy with meaning for someone like me who can't help seeking it everywhere. A way to make order out of the chaos of this world. Ruining, word for making a song of lamentation, a poem of mourning, which is what this is. What I'm trying to say is that to understand America, I spent the day in Tulsa thinking about democracy, standing on Greenwood, sifting through the archives, postcards of the destruction, and watching from a distance the slow unearthing of history settle down in the soil. Resurrection of the long buried in a mass grave at Oaklawn, an aperture, waiting room of the lost, evidence of the nearly erased rising now to the surface like a reckoning, a toehold on the truth.
This audio poem is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Mary Ann Andre, Charles Lipper and Cass Ali at Volubility Podcasting, and Scott Steinman at Studio Media Recording Company. To hear the full story behind this poem, listen to Switchyard Podcast Episode 2, a conversation with Natasha Trethewey.